of the things you say. Talk to me in your own special way. Welcome New Mexico and around the world, around the country, if you're listening to Dialogue, KSFR's Friday evening talk show where the conversation starts with you. I'm your host, MK, and I have got an extraordinary guest on my show today. I feel very lucky to have this woman joining us today. Her name is Dr. Harriet Fraad, and she's a mental health counselor and hypnotherapist in private practice in New York City. Her work explores the intersections of American personal, economic, and political life and the relationship between capitalism, gender, family, and relationships at large. She helps us understand just how capitalism hits home, which is also the name of her new podcast, which you can find on her website. And that's harrietfraad.com, and that's Harriet and FRAAD.com. So Harriet, FRAAD.com. Her most recent articles appeared in Alternet and the Book of Knowledge Class in Economics, Marxism Without Guarantees. She appears regularly on the radio TV show Economic Update and also appears on such shows as Redacted Tonight with Lee Camp on RTTV. Her work can be found on her website. Welcome, Harriet. Can you hear me?
I certainly can, and I'm glad to be here.
Well, it's a true pleasure to have you on the show. And the central question that I would like to put out to our listeners before we begin is the idea of looking at the question of whether or not our empire is dying, or what some people refer to as our empire. And we may have you back on a whole separate show where we can actually look into that topic in deeper dimensions. But for now, I'd like to just put that in the back of all the listeners' minds as we're listening to what you have to say, Harriet. But let's begin, if we can, I'd like you to go back and help us take a historical look at how gender relations changed after World War II, and how that has led us to what some people call the Trump phenomenon, and also things like Sugar Baby University and the confirmation of Kavanaugh. So how did we arrive to that historically, starting from World War II?
Well, what happened was, after World War II, every other industrialized wealthy nation was in shambles. They were bombed. Germany, Japan, France, and to a lesser extent, but also England. And we were the dominant economy in the world. The two survivors of World War II who were dominant were the United States and what was then the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was also heavily bombed. They lost 30 million people because people fought the Nazis by hand in the streets in the Soviet Union. And we lost nowhere near them, and our nation was intact. And we were very prosperous. And because we were an even more racist and sexist nation than we are now, but we came back, soldiers came back to a boom economy. And in that boom economy, in order to give the returning service people back their jobs, women were then thrown off the labor force. They had been induced into the labor force during the war to work in the munitions factories and other places that men had deserted for the service, and then they were pushed back into the household. Well, that was a very prosperous time, the late 40s and 1950s in America. That slowly changed as the other economies like Germany and Japan revived, as did the Soviet Union. And so there was more competition. Americans between the 40s and the 70s lived a decent life, particularly if there was a white and male who was the breadwinner. Actually, between the 1820s and the 1970s, each generation of Americans did better financially than the one before, unless they didn't have a white male as the head of the household, because the best jobs in what was then a scarce labor market were reserved for white men who got two wage supplements, one from being white and another for being male. Well, in the 1970s, the computers were perfected, multinational communication systems were perfected, mechanical engineering made huge gains, and so that the United States, big capitalist corporations, could outsource jobs to places where workers work for almost nothing. China has the highest wages in Asia, and the average is $3.23 an hour. In a place like Bangladesh, it could be less than $1 an hour. And so in order to make greater profits, they exported millions of jobs, computerized millions more, and mechanized and robotized even more. So that white males who were used to getting a family wage that could support a family, whether they had one or not, and these in a better labor position because they were white and male, were dispossessed. At the same time, women got sick of being stuck in the household, and also their husbands were getting less money, so they were pushed into the labor force. Mm-hmm. And with it, millions and millions of women entered the labor force.
And these are referred to as pink-collar jobs, correct? I mean, there were more jobs in the service industry available to women than there were male jobs, right? As the male jobs were getting outsourced, female,
And what was left as the United States began to convert from being a manufacturing economy to being a service job economy, a service economy, there were more jobs for women at lower wages. And with racism, for black women, it was the lowest wages. But there were more jobs for women. And at the same time as there were more jobs, there was a women's liberation movement which encouraged women to get out and make our own money and be our own people. And also, male jobs could no longer support a family. They never could for minority families, but white families needed two incomes to make less than the standard of living that one used to provide. And so women were also economically forced out of the home and into the labor force.
And can we talk about how that affected the dynamic between men and women? Unless you wanted to talk about something else there.
No, that's what I'm building up to here.
Yes.
Well, once women were working a full day outside of the household, they were far less willing to come home and do a second shift, as Arlie Hochschild called it, in the house. All the housework, the child care, the emotional connecting of men to friends and family, the social connecting, and the sexual services that men were used to. At the same time, men wanted to recoup the manhood they felt they lost by not being providers who could provide for their families with extra sexual services, extra emotional services, extra social connections that women should make for them by inviting their families over and friends. And conflict was created, as women were much less eager to do a second shift and be treated as if they were servants of men when they were out there earning money that contributed to and often was crucial to the household economy. And conflict was generated. Yeah. There had been, and this was always so in minority communities, the black family had not stayed intact the way the white families did. Black families had more children born outside of wedlock.
Mm-hmm.
And now whites are joining them. You know, in the 1960s, 10% of white children were born outside of a marriage. Now it's about 40%. That's a big difference, because women no longer want to be taking care of men and children and working outside of the household. And with that, sex roles began to change. What didn't change in the United States was the government's support of new family forms, so that as Germany and France and all the Scandinavian countries who have women working have special supplements for lower rentals for single mothers, wage supplements, child care allowances, free child care, after school care, and summer care. The United States did none of those things. And there was a demand for the conditions of existence of a different family. And that was in progressive circles. At the same time, the evangelical community was pushing that women should be subordinate to men. That's in the Southern Baptist Convention on Men and Women, which is still observed by evangelical religions, that even if a woman is earning more money outside, her position should be subordinate inside, and men should never be subordinate to women in jobs. So women can't be ministers or leaders or CEOs within the evangelical community and in their corporations. And so that there were these two poles. On the one hand, there was a big demand for child care and after-school care and family leave and maternity care and paternity care and leaves, and more family vacation time. The United States was giving less and less, because why should they? They could always export people's jobs. Whereas the rest because they had very strong socialist and communist parties and powerful unions, didn't let that happen. And so the country became polarized in the way we can see over Donald Trump. So much so that when Ronald Reagan was president, a bill was passed that would have allowed Head Start for all American families, free, quality child care. And Reagan vetoed it on the basis that children should be only with their families. And the evangelical community sold the idea that women's honored position is in the household, and they did pay homage to women's household work. However, they never supported and actually opposed everything that would make marriages and households easier. Now the divorce rate among all Americans is 50%, and then there's another 15 to 20% of people who don't get a legal or formal divorce, which costs money, but many people don't have assets to fight over, so they make an agreement and they separate without legal means, so that we have the majority of Americans are not with their biological parents. The majority of children don't grow up with their two biological parents. That's 75% of children, between people not living with their the partners with whom they have children, and also getting divorced and separated. There's a mass change in what a family is.
Yeah.
Our families are much more like what African American families were like in the 1960s, which Donald Moynihan attributed to black pathology. It wasn't black pathology. It's the inability of the old family form to be sustained, and also very few supports for that. It's an untenable system, so untenable that the red states, which have many more evangelicals, have a much higher divorce rate than the blue states. Because women are no longer willing to tolerate service to men who boss them around, and the overwhelming burden of domestic, emotional, and sexual service while going out and also having to work. 39% of women make more money than their partners do, and so then coming home to the entire burden is too much. The only people whose families lasted more or less intact were the people who could hire other poorer women as nannies, house cleaners, shoppers, errand doers, and go out to dinner and so on. That's why marriage has become a luxury good, and gender has shifted. For the first time in our history, the majority of people between 18 and 35, which is what they consider for their statistics, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the prime fertility years, the majority are not married. Because the conditions for marriage of protection for women and children, financial protection, and both the burden of having to support a family and also the means to be able to support a family for white people no longer exist for the mass of people. They exist for the prosperous 20%, and the 1% still have a lot of children, people at the very top, and totally dependent on working wives. There's an interesting book called Primates of Park Avenue that studies the 1% and what they do, where the women are like the manager of a feudal estate, still a serf, but the manager of other people's labor. Well, that's a revolutionary shift. It's a shift from household feudalism, where women produce useful things like serfs did, and give that over to the lord of the manor, keeping some for themselves, and conflict between communal families, where people want to share equally, and independent families, where people live independently and have their children by themselves in an independent situation. That's a total revolution of the family. And people like Trump are trying to appeal to white men who want to bring back the position of lord of the manor that they used to have when they supported their families. Of course, he's not bringing back the family wage. His own Make America Great Again hats are made in China, and so were Ivanka's fashion lines. But whatever, he sold a lot of people on go back to the good old days when white people were supreme, when the minority population was much less, when we didn't allow refugees into, when refugees were accommodated into our country because there was room. Bring back the good old days, but without the refugees, and just make men rich again compared to women, and white people rich and powerful compared to minorities. He has sold some people on that dream.
Yeah, and also I just think this is, your take on things is so unique, because you really look at how the economic situation of our lives then impacts us personally. And a lot of times on this show, I like to talk about, I call it imperialism. I prefer to use that term above all, because it's and how it infiltrates our personal lives and even our personal interactions. And so this dynamic between gender now, this division that's happening and sort of getting obviously reignited in the last, starting with the Me Too movement, and then now the Kavanaugh confirmation sort of, it's now seems that it's going to be about, this next election it's all about a theater of men versus women. How do we take ourselves out of that as men and women and try to bring back the family, the positives of the family? Because I also think about people who've survived these times, and I can even think about my own brother who had a decent job but whose wife stayed at home for a good portion of their lives and brought the family up, but then decided to go back to work. And they've had a 30-odd year marriage, but it's a fluidity, a willingness to be fluid and to acknowledge each other in the relationship that seems to allow marriages to last. Do you have any advice for people who might be finding themselves in situations like this where maybe they are going to divide or divorce or separate and maybe find their way through it to another side of greater union?
Yes, well, one of the things that can unify people is fighting for the conditions of existence for a communal sharing marriage. And that would be free universal child care like the other developed countries have, maternity and paternity leaves. In Sweden and Norway, paternity leaves are compulsory so that men won't think they're getting extra credit by not being home with their kids. Family leaves and vacation. The United States has less vacation than any other developed country. Mm-hmm. France has 5 weeks guaranteed paid vacation, for example. Brazil has 6. That we'd have to fight for those things together. Also, look for communal ways to raise children. Look for child care where people pool together and help, and therefore can afford someone to take care of their children. The average child care costs for a family with one child are more than the community college costs. In a city like San Francisco, which is expensive, it's a bargain if you have 2 children in one family to have child care in a quality setting for $46,000 a year. In some places like rural Ohio, it might be only $10,000 each. But that's prohibitive.
Yeah.
Because, let's face it, 60% of Americans don't have $500 in savings in case of an emergency. Mm-hmm. People are barely getting by, and so they can't afford to have children. Our fertility rate is the lowest it's been since the Great Depression, and the reason is that people can't afford it. And so our idea of family, which is you grow up, you get married, you have children, that's over.
Yeah.
You would have to change to create the conditions for family. You have to give families the support they have everywhere else in the developed world.
Resources. And the idea that I also like about family leave is that for those who are concerned about saying, well, I really don't want to leave my child in daycare, or I don't know who's running the state daycare agency or something, that they themselves are allowed to go home and be with their own children and give that time to their own children and family.
That's right.
Yeah.
In France, you have up to 5 years of paid maternity leave. Now, you get paid less as you stay home more, but, after the first 2 years, you get paid less, but you're still paid, and the government pays the difference, so it isn't the company that has to take a hit financially because you take a leave.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, 100% of French 3-year-olds are in the quality child care centers they have, which have far more resources than any home could provide. They have 2 teachers, one a master's degree teacher in every classroom, the other an associate's degree child development teacher. They have a nurse practitioner, a pediatric nurse practitioner on hand, so that there's a sick room. If your child is sick and you need to go to work, you can bring your child there. And they have after hours so that you could get home later after work and pick up your child. And it's such quality care that it's 100%.
Yeah. This is I'm sorry. Go ahead.
And as a side benefit of that, which is part of why French people stand up when their benefits are taken away, and march and are in the streets is because they bond with the same group from the time they're really little. They see that group, they bond with that group, they're engaged with that group, and they have a sense of being part of a group that develops together. Very important.
Yeah, in fact, I noticed one of your recent podcasts was on why are Americans not protesting, and one of the questions I had for you for sure about that was I had the feeling right before Kavanaugh was confirmed, before Senator Flake stepped up and said, okay, wait a minute, we're going to have to give this an FBI investigation, or, before he made that move. And I don't know if you were able to see, or hopefully most people were able to see the elevator scene where the protesting women confronted Flake and, about how they felt and the fact that he was going to confirm, vote for Kavanaugh. And the frustration in those women's voices at that time made me feel, I wondered that if they had confirmed him in that moment, if they would have been that angry to storm the Capitol, and if that was part of why it went, part of why they decided to say, wait, hold on, we've got to calm this situation, simmer down here for a second before we actually go through with it. But, I kind of wonder, once he was confirmed, why were women not storming the Capitol? Why are they not? I mean, you could hear some of the women in the chambers that were protesting, and you could hear them screaming, literally. I mean, they are feeling, some women who've been assaulted are feeling hugely traumatized felt even more traumatized by the confirmation. Why are we as women not really moving into that Capitol with full bodies?
Well, part of it is,
in a more forceful way, I should say. I shouldn't say that people aren't protesting, because they are. But why are we not protesting? Almost at a point where we've got to put our lives on the line. I'm talking civil protests of the 1960s, where, people took their lives into their hands in some cases, or at least their bodily, risked bodily harm to protest. Why are we not seeing that?
Well, it takes a little while to adjust that someone who's, first of all, the FBI hearing didn't allow, it heard only 9 people out of the 40 witnesses that they should have heard, and was curtailed and managed by the president's attorney, Mathon. So, of course, it was a bogus hearing.
Right.
I think it takes people a little while to realize the extent to which they've been betrayed. It was a majority of vote. Flake voted for Kavanaugh as well. And Kavanaugh behaved the way, if a woman behaved that way, crying and snarling and attacking, she would have been dismissed as hysterical. But they had made that decision before. And I think in order to change it, a mass protest would have to be organized. The way the Women's March was, that was the biggest demonstration America ever had, because it takes people a while to realize the extent of the betrayal. Also, when we talk about women, it's not all women. A very narrow majority of white women voted for Trump. I don't know how many would again, but there will be plenty, because some women, having been trained to feel that their lives are dependent on the approval of men, will vote along with whatever the men around them dictate. That's true. And it was only 1974 where women were first able to get credit in our own names. And there's a long, long history of women's welfare being utterly dependent on being attractive and accommodating to some man who would support them.
And in fact, I want to touch on something you touched on in an interview I watched, and that was this idea of the Sugar Baby University and how we got there. That there's this mythology that men and women are equal now, but yet we have things like Sugar Baby University. I think, is it Sugar Daddy or Sugar Baby University popping up? Yeah, and how and why that exists. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. The sugar industry basically developed because education costs have become prohibitive, and yet an education is crucial to get ahead in a job. And the one thing...
So for those who don't know what the sugar industry is, can you explain what that is? Yeah.
The sugar industry is part of what's been a long tradition, but is now very formalized and enormously widespread, which is where a wealthy older man, or at least a wealthy man, pays a young woman for what is called in the sex trades a GF, girlfriend experience. And so that when he comes to town, she's on hand. There are often sexual agreements between these parties, and this has developed because education costs are prohibitive. An uneducated woman can only manage to make any kind of money in the sex trades. And women, as well as men, have to pay exorbitant costs for an education. It's $100,000 to get through an Ivy League education. It's prohibitive. And at the Ivy Leagues, particularly the more prestigious ones in the South, Sugar Baby University is a way of advertising university women who will become the babies for sugar daddies, and each of them will work out a contract together, what is expected and when and how much payment will be made, whether they're going to pay for tuition, whether they're going to give a yearly stipend, whether they're going to pay for that at credit cards. That is negotiated in the beginning and then not mentioned again unless it isn't honored. It's not mentioned so that the man can retain the delusion that this is a relationship of choice, that some very interesting, attractive woman who is educated enough to socialize with his peers and appear scholarly and interesting is going out with this older man. So that what has happened is the financial necessities and also the relaxations about sexuality have made that a way that young women who are in graduate school or college can actually get through college without being saddled with debt for 20 or 30 years when they graduate. And so they barter their personhood, their girlfriend experience on every level for a chance to be paid while they're in school. When these men are in town, they go out, they see each other, they're introduced to his colleagues, and then get prestige from that.
Yeah, and I think it's also interesting because as the sort of blue collar white male gets pushed out, the rich white man gets rewarded because the in terms of the male female economic survival, young poor women aren't going to want to be hanging out with more poor white men. They're going to want to go with somebody who has, the temptation is to go towards someone who has status, who can provide, so that they then can provide for themselves. And once again, the sort of that blue collar white male gets shoved aside or left asunder, as it were. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit also about, and I guess apparently some of these contracts involve sex too. It's almost like legal prostitution.
Yes.
Yeah. And pretty normal. I mean, it seems to be somewhat normalized these days that women consider, some women anyway, young women, really consider it's being seen as a viable option. Am I correct? Yeah.
Yes, and sexual access has been seen for a long time as a perk of male power, as Me Too and Time's Up reveal. If you're a campesina in the 20,000-strong Campesina Women's Union, you complain about how the manager or the person who assigns jobs takes sexual access as a prerequisite for assigning you to a decent job because he's misusing his power. Or Matt Lauer at CBS or whatever, or Weinstein to give you a job as an actress.
Mm-hmm.
That is taken as a perk of male power. And so you have to pay for the perk, all right. There's a sense that you barter whatever you can in this society to get ahead, including your sexuality.
Yeah, and even your sense of human relating. I mean, it's no better for the guy who's hiring the sugar baby than it is for the woman who's being hired as a sugar baby. And, you also talk about this rise in pornography as men became displaced in the workplace. Again, the blue-collar white man was, and we had affirmative action where we were bringing minorities up, and then women with the pink industry, pink-collar jobs. But then men were at home kind of feeling disempowered, and then another place to go to feel power was pornography. Correct?
Yes, that's absolutely true.
Mm-hmm.
Because heterosexual pornography, unlike homosexual pornography, involves dominance and subordination. In pornography, there's no humiliating act that a woman doesn't want to perform for a man. And it wasn't only for poor men, it was for all men, because women have to be respected on a different level. And this was at the same time as gender changed and the economy changed. There were 4 different avenues for men to go in to feel superior to women. One was pornography. Another was evangelical religions in which women are to be submissive. Another one was gun culture, which is very macho and so anti-female that the ad for the Bushmaster automatic weapon was, "Do you prefer tofu to meat? Does your girlfriend or wife make more money than you?" And there's a whole list that says, "Reinstate your manhood. Bushmaster, automatic weapon."
Wow, interesting. So they selling manhood as a means of selling guns.
That's right. As men lost their financial domination, they have, and there's also testosterone products that don't necessarily work, but that give men a sense that they are somehow stronger, more male.
Mm-hmm.
There's a whole, there are those 4 avenues which have flourished as men's economic position has been demoted and their political and social position is more vulnerable to Me Too accusations. And this is the capitalist system's way to sell vulnerable men a product like pornography, a multi-billion-dollar industry, instead of trying to solve a problem, which brings about the Donald Trump-Kavanaugh domination theme again.
Right, and I think that's a very important word you use to describe the men, vulnerable men. So this is the patriarchal, corporate capitalistic system exploits that vulnerability. It puts them in a place of being displaced and then further exploits the vulnerability. So this is not about beating men up. This is about saying, wow, we need to be taking better care of our men.
No, men and women have to take care of each other both. And our society has to take care of people together. And we also have been failed by unions that threw out all the leftists in the McCarthy era and have an anti-communist, anti-socialist, anti-left bias, and therefore are weak. The German Metal Workers Union, which is a union of hundreds of thousands of metal workers together, just won a 22-hour work week so that they could have better home life work balance. Can you imagine that in the United States today?
Mm-mm.
They have a militant union. And one of the reasons that men and women, metal workers, decided that is they want to be able to be home together, and they want the time and leisure. And the German employers had to give in to this, whereas the United States is very backward on these things.
Yeah. again, yeah, I'm sorry.
We can't forget the sort of wish to dominate that American elite men are into, too. You look at Kavanaugh, the only child of a judge and a well-paid lobbyist, who you can see dealt with some of his anguish by being a drunk, and the rest by dominating women through rape and coercion in front of other men. That they have their problems, too, not that my heart's particularly bleeding for them. But what has happened is really that there's a big shift. All that money that has been made overseas by outsourcing is brought home to buy the media. Fox News, the newspapers, the televisions, and so that people are inundated with an ideology whose most horrible example is Trump. That no matter what you do to people, you get what you can when you can. You grab pussy. You don't pay people, which he is notorious for that. You go into dubious contracts with Saudis and Russians to buy your overpriced apartments. You do what you can to get rich because that's where you've got to go. That's one impulse in this country. And the other is we have to change together. Men and women, everyone who cares for an ecologically sound, kind society has got to band together. So those are the alternatives we have. Because in times of dislocation, like what has happened to the American family, that happened to the German family in the early 1930s. And what Hitler promised was it's all the fault of the Jews, the Gypsies, the Slavs, who have hemmed in and humiliated Germany. Get rid of them. We will conquer the world. We will make Germany great again, right? And that's what Trump promises, a kind of fascistic thing. We can return white supremacy. We can return male supremacy. It's all the fault of these refugees and other countries who pick on us. He's always finding someone who's at fault besides capitalism. And that way, capitalism's role in immiserating people and shifting their jobs out of the country is completely hushed up.
Yeah.
So these two possibilities here that are polarizing.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, we have to take a short break, but we're going to come back. And if you just tuned in, we are speaking with Dr. Harriet Fraad, and she is a mental health counselor and hypnotherapist in private practice in New York City. But she also helps us explore the intersections of American personal, economic, and political life and the relationship between capitalism, gender, and family. And we'll be right back after this short message. And we are back. We are joined by Dr. Harriet Fraad. You're listening to Dialogue with KSFR on Friday evenings, where the conversation starts with you. And we're looking in particular at the effects on capitalism. And I prefer myself to say, I'm Harriet, just so you know, I'm a little on the fence about exactly where I stand in terms of capitalism and socialism, but simply because I see, I'm more afraid of a corporate state situation going on, corporate rule, kind of multinational companies, this huge merging of power at the top of all of us globally. That is the piece that really frightens me the most. And I wonder if we can venture into another domain. You did talk a bit about, in one of you were looking at sort of why we don't, why we aren't protesting, and how there are a variety of what you call state apparatus. Let me look at the word you use is state apparatus. Hold on. What did it tell me? Ideological Yeah, go ahead.
There are a lot of ideological state apparatuses.
Yes, that's okay. So you and actually, I want to venture into another one, because I wonder if there's one that could be added to the three that you mentioned. You mentioned the authoritarian family, the religion, and I just lost my. Hold on, we had the
education.
I'm sorry.
The third, authoritarian.
Oh, schools.
Families, authoritarian religions, and authoritarian education.
Right, education. There you go. And what I wonder is mental health also a means through which people are using, is that being used as a form of social control via coercion, and how the mental health industry is impacting, again, the family unit and our sense of empowerment. And if we can start by talking even about the DSM, and you did a whole podcast on that, and I'd love to touch on some of that if we could, and how that's putting many people in a disempowered state.
Well, the DSM is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which is something that every person in the mental health field has to use if they hope to get insurance compensation, because it has a list of diagnoses. It should be understood that that was started by capitalist drug corporations so that people's lives could be pigeonholed into a diagnosis that could be plugged into a medication. And even our National Institutes of Health have said that the Diagnostic Statistical Manual is inadequate because it doesn't say how a person got injured, how they were in psychological pain, what was happening. It just says you have anxiety, you get Xanax. It doesn't mention the medication you get, but you have anxiety disorder. You have X, Y, or Z disorder, and then the natural thing when people are proselytized by the drug companies is to plug it into a medication. In fact, if you have clients on insurance, I call them clients rather than patients, which makes it seem like people are sick rather than just troubled, but that you have to rationalize why you're not prescribing a medication. That's much cheaper for the insurers to just give you a prescription instead of help you through your problems so that you can see your way yourself and have the tools yourself to solve your problems. What they've done is they've sold the American people on the idea that they have biochemical disorders that can be corrected with a pill. Now, let's look at that a little more closely. In England, where they have a national health service, so their studies are not done by the drug companies themselves, as they are in the United States. They found that in 75% of cases, the usual antidepressants don't work at all, and in the 25% of severely depressed people where they do work, they work only temporarily, and you have to keep upping the dosage. Well, how could people be hoodwinked that way? The fact of the matter is that every emotional state has a biochemical concomitant. We are biochemical entities, and when we're upset or elated or anxious or anything within a very normal range, there are biochemical changes that take place. And when you have therapy or you do hypnosis and you find your own cure, there's biochemical changes in your body. So that saying that people have a biochemical disorder is silly. Everybody has a biochemical concomitant to what they're feeling.
Yeah, and in fact, we have about 2 minutes left. And I wonder, the question I would have is, are we pathologizing normal human reaction to larger socioeconomic challenges and conditions?
Absolutely. Yes, we are. A lot of people's anxiety is because, we have a president who could get us nuked just because he's temperamental. We are losing all the wars. We've lost or come to a draw with every war we've fought since World War II. Over $700 billion of our money is spent in armaments. We're in over 100 countries, and we don't have the basics that every other industrialized country has. Free child care, free health care, free after-school care, and summer care. What's wrong here? Family leaves, personal leave. We don't have them. Family life balance, vacations. And we have the money.
Right.
And that's anxiety-provoking.
Absolutely. I think the fear I have, and we've got 1 minute left, the fear I have is that what scares me about this notion of socialism, the only thing that scares me is when I see what they're doing with mental health, and they've got everybody on medications, and it seems to be almost a covert way of controlling our society. If I'm under that rule, no thank you. I want my freedom. I want to be, I don't. So how can we make sure that doesn't happen?
Well, we need a system of checks and balances everywhere. And we need an economy that's based on co-ops where people who work there make the decisions of what to do, how to do it, and what their purpose is, rather than having a corporate ladder in which they're commanded and can take their job to a cheaper place. We need economic democracy, we need political and social democracy, and we need checks and balances on money, which we don't have. Our forefathers were smart to decide that checks and balances were necessary, but there was none on money, so you can buy the whole thing.
Thank you. I'm sorry. Unfortunately, I've got to say goodbye. Thank you so much, Harriet. Again, if you want to find more about her, you can go to harrietfraad.com. That's FRAAD.com, harrietfraad.com. Thanks so much for joining us today, and thank you, listeners, for joining us. Have a wonderful week. Sorry about that, Harriet. I didn't mean to cut you off.
The link for my website, then the show can be on my website?
Yeah, absolutely. I can send you a link, and once it's recorded, they'll send it to me, then I'll send that along to you.
Great. And if your listeners have comments or anything that they want to ask me, you can give them my email. That's fine.